Tilea's Troubles, Part 45. What happened outside Astiano. Adding injury to insult. A battle report. Astiano, autumn, 2402. The boys had found a place to talk where they would not be disturbed. As the city was so crowded with newly arrived soldiers and the survivors from Trantean, although not at all as crowded as it might have been if things had turned out differently. There were few places left where they could meet without being overheard, or, more annoyingly, without someone telling them they ought to be elsewhere, doing something else. Surely, in a dank, unused anticellar, beneath the buildings that had replaced the ruins of the city's ancient amphitheatre, they would be alone. It was cold and cave-like, and certainly no one would choose to sleep there. For not only was it damp and noisome, the latter due to the foul waters that seeped in from the street gutters of the city above, it was also exactly the kind of place the old stories populated with the vile uomini ratto. If more refugees had made it from Trantean, then it would likely have been occupied, for want of other dwelling places in the besieged city. And if the enemy outside were employing mortars and cannons to pound the city, then there would certainly have been people down here, simply for the relative safety it might provide. Just now, it was bearable for an hour's talk, during the day at least, when light came through the ancient windows in the high roof. Most importantly, it was private. As always, Tommy had been the first to enter, and Vitty the last. This was not because they were, respectively, the oldest and the youngest, but because Tommy wanted his friends to believe that he was scared of nothing, while Vitty was scared of almost everything, and could not hide the fact. Aldo, his head still reeling from all that he had witnessed, hadn't noticed, except that Fran went in beside him. Not that he cared either way, not like Tommy and Vitty. Once in, he began pacing, too agitated to sit. After the walk under the bright blue sky and the fresh air, his eyes and nose took a few moments to adjust. Tommy had pushed a rotting plank of timber out of the way to make a clear patch of ground, while Vitty, since crossing the threshold, had several times repeated, "Is it all right?" Finally Fran said, "Yeah, Vitty, it's fine. And anyway, we'll keep an eye out for trouble." As soon as they had all agreed that this was a good place to talk, Tommy, the burliest of the boys, turned to Aldo. "You can't have seen it all," he said, continuing the line of enquiry he had pursued ineffectively on the walk there. "It makes no sense. You weren't outside and you weren't on the wall." Aldo smiled knowingly. It wasn't that he was feeling cocksure, rather that he had always corrected Tommy with that smile, and he now did so unthinkingly. "You're right," he said. "I wasn't. I was in the gate tower, and I had a window all to myself." "That can't be right," said Fran. "There was a cannon on that tower which burned up bad. I saw it the next day. If you were there, the fire would have got you." "They wouldn't have let you stay there anyway," added Tommy. "They didn't know I was there, because whenever anyone came through, going up or down or across, I hid in a pile of sacks. I stood in an empty one, see, and whenever I heard anyone coming, I stooped down and closed it over me. Just another sack in the pile." "So why aren't you burned?" asked Fran. "Sackcloth burns, so you should have." "Did you run away before it blew up?" added Tommy in a mocking tone. "Or were you in a soggy sack?" "Shut up, Tommy. You don't know anything. The cannon was up on top, with a stone roof between me and it. I heard it every time it fired, as well as the last time." Aldo hesitated. "I looked up afterwards, when it went quiet." The others stared at him with bated breath. He fell silent, his eyes suddenly seeming to lose sight of his friends, as if he was looking at something else. "What do you see?" asked Vitty. "Was it dead bodies?" added Fran. Aldo frowned as his eyes focused on his friends again. "Yeah, but it wasn't the worst thing I saw." The others just waited now. Aldo knew he was supposed to tell them about the battle. Why else had they all come here? But now, just as it was expected of him, he wondered if he could. Then, surprising himself, he suddenly realised he had already begun talking. The soldiers from Trantean arrived first, all footmen, no horses. There were 2 lots of crossbows and a crazy-looking engine like a bunch of handguns all bound together. Behind them, some way off, was a train of wagons and lots of people, grown-ups and kids. I thought the soldiers would stop outside the walls to make sure the people and the wagons got in, but they didn't. They had 2 grey-haired men with them, in robes and carrying fancy staffs, wizards, real ones, who shouted at them, telling them to march through the gateway right away. Then I had to become a sack again, because the soldiers came up onto the wall, passing right through the room. They went both ways out onto the wall, until one lot was on one side and the rest on the other. I thought the engine would come in through the gate too. There was a grate in the floor I could look down through. But one of the wizards was shouting that there wasn't time to bring it in, and so it stayed just in front of the gate. Then I heard screaming outside, so I looked through the window. The men, loads of them, had come away from the crowd with the wagons. It was the women and children who were screaming, and I thought the men were going to run through the gate like the soldiers had done, leaving the others behind. But they didn't. Instead, they all came together, right past the gate, marching like soldiers beside the wall, with some big fella shouting orders. They weren't soldiers. When they passed by under my window, I saw they had no swords, no armour, just sticks, pitchforks, clubs, scythes. Sharp and nasty stuff, but not proper weapons. "Were they our militia?" demanded Fran. "They mustered. I know it because I saw them a-marching through the streets, flag up front. They've got proper weapons, pikes, so they must have gone out to fight." "I saw them all right," said Aldo. "Marched right up to the gate. But they didn't go out. One of them wizards shouted, 'Hold!' and they stopped. I heard him clear, because he was just on the other side of the door to me." "That can't be right," said Fran. "What with them Tranteans outside being chased? The militia must have gone out to help them." "No," said Aldo, going pale. He sniffed. "I wish they had. I didn't know it then, but now I wish they had. They just stayed on the inside of the gate. I thought it might be some kind of trick." The other boys already had an idea why Aldo was upset. There were rumours all over the city. Right now, they were beginning to get an inkling that the truth might be even more horrible than people were saying. "There was a lot of banging and clattering up above, where the cannon was," continued Aldo, "and a fella shouting, 'Make her ready.' I heard that a few times later on, in between the bangs. The voice got quieter, I think, but my ears were ringing, so maybe it was just them playing up. Then someone else cried the same words, and I looked out of the window. Down below, the war engine that came from Trantean was being cranked, and 3 iron balls were rolled into it from a plank they'd been sitting on. The gunners were Pavonans, blue and white, like the men on the cannon up top." Aldo had wondered at the time why the soldiers had made so much effort to get that to Astiano first, before the wagons and the poor folk of Trantean, but he didn't mention that now. "It was a complicated thing, that engine, a mess of levers and gears. I couldn't make much sense of it. I looked out across the field to the wagons and saw they were crammed with stuff, piled high. The horses pulling them looked to be in a bad way. There was no room left on the wagons for people, so the crowd came alongside them." The other 3 boys looked at each other. They already knew the deadly fate of that crowd, just not the whys and wherefores. "Why didn't they just come in with the crossbowmen?" asked Tommy. "Why'd they lag behind like they did?" Aldo frowned. "I think they were going as fast as they could. A lot of them were old, or little uns, and the mothers amongst them were carrying even smaller ones, and all of them had bags and other burdens. I think when the men marched off, they left all their stuff behind, making more of a burden." Now it was Vitty's turn to frown. "Why'd the men do that?" "Oh, I don't think they left to run away. They were still trying to look after them. I think they went off so that they could try to hinder the brutes." "Did you see the brutes?" asked Vitty. "My uncle told me that it ain't even all of them," said Tommy, "that Razga's got 2 armies. The other one's still busy looting Tranteo." Aldo stifled a laugh. Not a happy sort of laugh, but the nervous sort that can turn into sobs. There were plenty enough. When they came, I thought they were nearer than they really were, because they were all so big. Their skins were grey, and they wore nothing but breeches and plates of armour, and carried blades the size of doors. There were monsters in amongst them, like giant, hairy bulls with more brutes on their backs. I was expecting them to be a bit like the caravan guards that visit the city, except more wild and ragged, screaming and wailing and cavorting about, but they weren't. They came along in a long line, like the militia on parade, all neat and tidy and in step. Some were shouting with voices louder than horns. I think that's what kept them in line. They didn't stay so neat, though. I reckon they saw that some of the Tranteans had already got in, and that there was no one apart from a little company of handgunners and the Trantean mob between them and the walls, so they started running, which made the ground thunder. Someone on the walls kept shouting, "Steady, steady," over and over. Outside they were whipping the draft horse as something rotten. I could hear the beast squealing and groaning. Some moved a bit more quickly, but others foundered, so the wagons got strung out a bit. The women near them had stopped their screaming, but I could still hear the children crying. Then came the first bang, and the room filled with dust. My ears went funny, but my eyes were working, and I saw one of the hairy monsters was rearing up. I reckon the shot had landed right in front of it, maybe even clipped it. It didn't slow down, though, and I don't think the rest of the brutes even noticed. "Anyone would notice a cannon shooting at them," said Fran. "You don't miss a thing like that. We could hear it from the Via Strogsi." Aldo was shaking his head. "You didn't see the brutes. They had cannons themselves, loads of them. Not on carriages, they were just carrying them. There were 2 gangs hefting them. Think about it. If you're brute enough to carry a cannon into battle, do you think you'd flinch because another one fired from hundreds of yards away?" Fran said nothing. Aldo knew that all the boys had seen ogres before, even in the city. Not just caravan guards, but warehouse guards, bodyguards, and even performers in the annual spettacolo. They knew full well the feats of strength brutes were capable of, even the sort of civilised ogre who lived amongst men. Bouldergut's army was made of the real thing, however, as brutal as they get, from the wild east and beyond. They were surely stronger, tougher, and meaner, as well as cruel beyond human measure. When the brutes used their cannons, it was like thunder rumbling in the distance. I think they killed some of the handgunners behind the wall near the hut, but it was hard to tell which ones were just hiding and which had fallen. The Trantean mob kept marching on. I thought maybe they were just going to march off to another gate, because they were getting really far away from the wagons. The soldiers on the walls were shouting at them, angry words, so I wasn't the only one who wondered what they were doing. Then I saw something bright out of the corner of my eye, and when I turned to look, it was coming right at me, a burning ball as big as the sun at midday, and getting bigger. I ducked down as quick as I could to put the stone wall between me and it, and I still felt the heat wash over my back. It didn't burn me, because I don't think it was coming at the window. It was aimed at the battlement, above. Tommy was agitated. "That's when the cannon blew up." Aldo shook his head. "No, not then." "You just said it was," insisted Tommy. "No, I didn't," denied Aldo. "I just said there was a ball of fire. It hurt the cannon crew, I know, because one of them was screaming. But another was shouting, 'Cover the budge barrel and douse the carriage.' Then the screaming stopped, and the voice said, 'Make her ready.' When the smoke had cleared a bit, I looked out the window again. The wagons were slowing down now, the horses stumbling. Some women and old men had fallen and were being dragged along by the others. I could hear a strange chanting from the wall at the side of the chamber, then another voice, almost the same, from the other side, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the wizards. It had to be. They were conjuring up magic, and it made me feel dizzy. But I had the windowsill to hold on to, so I watched to see what would happen. When the chanting stopped, at first there was nothing. Then I saw it. The giant bull monsters, which had got ahead of the rest of the brutes, were moving much slower, so that the brutes on foot were catching up to them. I knew it was the magic that had done it, because the riders on their backs were thrashing the reins and beating the beasts' heads. But the beasts were stumbling, as bad as the horses on the wagons. and not just the one that had reared up at the round shot, but all three of them. Then, just when I thought they might really be running away, the Trantean mob turned, swinging around to face the enemy. I think they'd gone that far out so that they could get at the brutes from the side, or maybe lure them away from the wagons and the womenfolk. Way up ahead, the little line of handgunners fired again, but the sound of it was nothing compared to the blast of the brutes' hand cannons. It really looked like the wagons had a chance now, if the horses could be kept on their feet and pulling, but they were so slow, it was horrible to watch. When the gun above me went off again, it made my head feel like bursting, and it started my ears a-ringing something rotten. I rubbed my eyes to make them work, and I saw one of the monstrous bulls on the ground. Fran was nodding. Yes, they killed it. I saw it from the wall when I took wine up to the men after the battle. Umpteen crows feasting on it. It was the cannon, agreed Aldo. I thought the crew would start cheering, but I couldn't hear a thing. Maybe they did cheer. Maybe they couldn't even hear it themselves. I went back to watching, and I saw the handgunners running away. They weren't cowards, no way. They'd been up closer than anyone else. I reckon they just knew staying there was stupid. But they'd left it too late, because a bunch of brutes in the middle of the line, the closest to them, were running too, and they came on much faster. When the brutes caught up with the men, they just ran right on, right over them, and the handgunners disappeared underneath. Then the brutes stopped, like they wanted to take a breath or two and have a look around. Those ones looked meaner than all the others. They had the biggest weapons, swords as big as the sails on a windmill, and a hammer that looked like it could smash the city walls down. "Could it?" asked Vitty, tears welling in his eyes. Aldo expected to hear Tommy or Fran laugh, but they didn't. They were looking at him just as intently as Vitty. "I don't know," said Aldo. "Maybe. But the brute carrying it would get stuck with 100 bolts if he tried." This seemed to reassure Vitty somewhat. The rest of the brutes were some way behind this front lot now, all bunched up, getting in each other's way. The Trantean mob were now the closest to the brutes. They didn't charge, though. They just stood there, waving their pitchforks and scythes around. They didn't have a flag to wave. They didn't even have drums to beat. But they were doing their best to look like they meant business. They had to be brave men, because there were 4 brutes right in front of them, carrying those cannon barrels, and they hadn't fired them yet. The Trantean mob now went straight towards the brutes with the cannons, not running, just walking. The big fella was shouting, but he was too far away for me to know what he was saying, even if my ears hadn't been ringing so bad. They kept together, packed tight, and there were so many of them, I thought maybe they could beat the brutes. The women were close to the gate now, a few more steps and they'd be through. There was a fat Morite priest leading them, and a Shalian priestess. Some soldiers on the wall were shouting, "Hurry up," and stuff like that. I wondered if there was a prayer I could say to help them, but all I could think of was my Morite prayers, and it didn't seem right praying for their souls like they were about to die. Then I heard a clackety sound. The Bavonans below the window were cranking the weird engine. One of the crew poured powder into a funnel, and another blew ashes off a match cord on a linstock. They were going to shoot it. I wondered if it would be louder than the cannon, what with all them barrels. But it was outside, not overhead, and besides, my ears were already ringing so bad I doubted it could hurt them much more. The wagoneers were whipping more cruelly than ever. There was blood on the horses' hides. Another boom sent my head a-spinning again. When I looked out to see if it was the engine below, there was no smoke, and the crew were hopping about, agitated. I think it was broken, because they hefted it up and dragged it towards the gate, getting in the women's way. The boom must have come from the cannon on top, but when I looked, I couldn't see where their shot had gone. The ogres were really close now. The ones near the Trantean mob laid into them. It was horrible. I saw 2 men hurled through the air like nothing more than dolls. They hit the ground, and they didn't move after that. One of the cannons went right off in their midst, which sent more spinning out the back, and others staggering out like they were drunk. None of the brutes fell, and in a moment the Tranteans were running. The brutes went after them, their blood up. If it weren't for their heavy iron burdens, they would have caught them and killed more, but the Tranteans outran them back towards the wall. The hairy bull monsters were close too. They had umpteen horns on their heads, and their mouths looked like the gargoyles on the church of Santo Anredo the Furtive. If my ears had been working, I bet I could have heard them snorting. The brutes on their backs were riding so high, I wondered what tricks they'd used to get up there. Then it happened, said Aldo, before going silent. He covered his face with his hands, and even though that meant they could not see it, the other boys knew he was scrunching it up. Vitti put his hand on Aldo's shoulder. "It's all right," he said. "You don't have to tell us if you don't want to." "No," Tommy said. "He does have to tell us. He said he would." Aldo wasn't really listening to the boys, but he did notice they'd stopped talking. He steeled himself now, and somehow the words came out. "There was smoke coming up from under the window. I thought maybe the weird engine was on fire, but I was wrong. The smoke was coming from the crowd of Trantean women and children. It was as if someone had dug a fire pit all around them, set it alight, and then dumped damp straw on it to make thick, white, heavy smoke. They stopped, wide-eyed, like they didn't know what to do. It all happened fast. I know that now, but it felt horribly drawn out. Sparks flickered in the smoke, then changed into flashing veins. I think the soldiers on the walls were shouting again, because some of the children looked up. One of them saw me. He didn't look frightened, just bewildered. He waved at me. Before I could wave back, the smoke itself burst into flames, becoming a wall of fire. Even at the window, it felt like a torch being held a foot from my face, but I had to keep looking. If I'd been down on the ground, it would have been bad enough, knowing the women were inside that burning wall. Being above them, I could see them all. A few of those on the outside began screaming, batting and patting the flames on their skirts and cloaks, or on other people's clothes, and this made the others push inwards, forcing themselves backwards, even though some fell underneath their feet. They were crammed together, trying to push past each other. I don't think they knew the fire was all around, not just on one side. Next to them, the Pavone and gunners pulling the engine just carried on. They were right beside the horror, yet they just kept dragging their burden. Even when some of the women tried to run through the flames and came out ablaze, collapsing at the soldiers' feet. Then the gun disappeared under the window, through the outer gate. So I went over to the grate on the murder hole, and I looked down to see it below. I could hear the sounds coming up through the hole in the stone, even with my bad ears. Someone shouted, "It's in!" And then I heard the clang of the outer gate shutting. Aldo was shaking his head as he spoke. I couldn't get my head around it. The wagons were still outside, the women and the children, and so close. I thought it has to be some clever trick. But it wasn't. And I knew it, because the walls went quiet, and the men down below the hole stopped moving altogether. None of the soldiers were shouting anymore. They'd closed the gates, and they weren't planning on opening them again. Fran's face screwed into an angry frown. "So they decided to save the gun and not the people?" Aldo nodded. The Tranteans were frantic. Umpteen were already trampled. Then they lurched all of a sudden to one side, which turned into a running leap through the fire and out onto the other side, where they fell, writhing and burning. Only two got past the mess of dying folk. Another boy and a man with his arm in a sling. I don't know why they were so lucky. Outside, the brutes had caught up with the wagons. They swatted the wagoners aside, and even though the cannon sent a ball right into them, and the crossbowmen on the walls showered bolts down, felling 3 of them, they just turned the wagons around and began lugging them away, as if they cared nothing for the shooting. I saw one who was dragging a dead wagoner by the leg turn around and come back and grab one of the dead women by the hair. He dragged them both away, the bodies jolting along behind him, the woman smoking, 3 bolts hanging from his back and another in his belly. The smell was bad, like burning hair. Then I could smell another stink, like brimstone, and flames curled through the window from above. A burning man fell right past, without a sound. I knew something bad was happening, and I wanted to get out the tower, but as soon as I went towards the steps there was a massive boom, maybe more than one, and the whole tower shook, and it knocked me to the floor. I don't know how long I was down, but when I got up, I went over to the window. It was like a dream, like a nightmare. I couldn't hear a thing by then, but I could see. Outside, the brutes were moving away, but one of them stopped and turned. He was covered in paint, or tattoos, and he had some sort of mask on his face. He was dancing, his arms up in the air, and then suddenly he jerked to one side and disappeared. He was gone, like he'd jumped through a door. There was no door. The other boys were all staring intently at Aldo. Vitti's mouth was hanging open, while Tommy had his hands locked behind his head like he was holding it in place. Talking about it brought back the crazy feeling Aldo had felt at the time, and he now had to stifle a giddy sort of sob. He did not entirely succeed. That's when I went up to see what happened to the cannon. Like I said, it was like a dream. Everything felt unreal. The cannon was there, all burned, and the crew were there, still burning, and the smell was worse than ever. So I said sorry, and I went back down again. Back at the window, I could see that the brutes who weren't stealing the Trantean wagons were standing their ground, shooting handgun-sized pistols and their carriageless cannons at the walls. Shots pinged at the stone around the window, time and time again. Flecks of stone kept stinging me. As he spoke, Vitti reached out and touched one of the tiny scratches on his cheek. Aldo didn't notice. They shot again and again, he continued, and the men on the wall sent crossbow bolts raining back at them. Twice I saw flaming balls streak out from the walls and splash into the brutes. And then all of a sudden, the brutes just upped and left. I couldn't hear what was going on the walls, but then one of the soldiers appeared at the door. He looked at me, so I jumped over to the stairs and ran down. "Did he chase you?" asked Vitti. "No, he was too busy," said Aldo. "What do you mean busy?" "Spewing his guts up," answered Aldo.